Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Environment and Planning Committee. I declare the meeting open at 7 p.m. Acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of all lands, waters and sky in the Jordan River area. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who live, work and meet on these lands. Apologies. No apologies so far than tonight. And there were no requests to attend the meeting via audio visual link. Notice of live streaming of committee meeting. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is being broadcast for minute-taking purposes and is also being broadcast live to the public on Council's website in accordance with Section 5 of Council's Code of Meeting Practice. The recording will be made available on Council's website. Code of Meeting Practice. The order of business is as shown in the agenda, which has been made available. Staff and public are reminded that this meeting is open. Doors to the meeting room are to be left open unless the meeting moves into a closed confidential session, according to Section 14 of the Code of Meeting Practice. Only if the meeting moves into a closed confidential session will the public broadcasting of the meeting be suspended. Council's Code of Meeting Practice prohibits the electronic recording of meetings without express permission of Council. Mobile phones must be turned to silent during the meeting. Disclosures of interest. There's a few tonight, so I'll read them out. Councillor Borg has disclosed against ENV 01225 biodiversity and character FSPA plan proposal proposes to add the park adjacent to a property to the FSPA area. It's non-significant, non-pecuniary interest. Mayor Elise Borgs also disclosed on the same matter, ENV 01225, address and nature of the land is subject to a change in zone planning control by the proposed LEP of the subject land, and it's a special disclosure of pecuniary interest. Mayor Borgs also disclosed on ENV 01225, address and nature of the land is subject to a change in zone planning control by the proposed LEP, the subject land, and that's also a special disclosure of pecuniary interest. Councillor Lansbury has disclosed on ENV 01225 the property leased is located within an indicative LMR housing area under the low and mid-rise housing policy. It's a non-specific, non-pecuniary interest. Councillor Allison has disclosed on ENV 01225 as its principal place of residence is within the existing forestry sea protection area. That's a special disclosure of interest. And finally, myself, I've disclosed on ENV 01225 having an interest in the land that is currently categorised under Section 6.6 of the GRLEP as forestry sea protection area. And that's also a special disclosure of pecuniary interest.
Mr. Chair, I think we got a one from yeah.
Oh,
we got a late one that can go in the run sheet.
Yeah, basics of where is it? Do you have it?
It's on the same ENV 02125 for the same. The address and nature of the land is subject to change in the zone planning control by the proposed LEP. Is that the same? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jason. In public forum tonight, we've got one recent speaker, Mr. Adrian Powell in person, speaking on ENV 01225, impact of the low and mid-rise housing policy stage 2. Thanks, Mr. Powell. You can go ahead.
Peter, can you hear me? No clock. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. Good evening, everybody. So, Oakleigh Flora and Fauna Conservation Society are here to support the council in its endeavour to progress the gateway determination of the integrated planning proposal, particularly the focus on Part A of that proposal. First of all, thanks to Joe and your team for doing an amazing report on the impact of the low and mid-rise housing policy that's going to have the impact on the Lord George's River area. We believe that if the Department of Planning rejects your proposal, there is a direct conflict with the New South Wales government mandate, I think, for tree canopy goal of 40% by 2038. If they don't go ahead and approve your proposal, we believe that the tree canopy in particular will suffer greatly. Currently, as you know, the tree canopy cover is about 20.59% in 2022, and that's a drop from 23.5 4 years before. If we are indeed going to achieve that target of 40% tree canopy cover, the gateway determination must go in favour of the council. In our limited research by the OFF members, we noticed that the two areas which form a huge part of the FSPA, Oatley and Magano, have a tree canopy cover of 40 to 100%, whereas other suburbs, Connells Point, for example, may only have a tree canopy cover of 20 to 30%. It's imperative that we support the council's effort to get that gateway determination in favour of you, because if the tree canopy cover disappears, there'll be other flow-on effects and water quality in the Georges River, wildlife habitat, and carbon drawdown. So Oatley Flora and Fauna will be supporting every effort by writing to the appropriate ministers as soon as your submission is put forward to the government. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks, Adrian. The next item is confirmation of minutes of previous meeting, ENV 01125. Confirmation minutes of Environment Planning meeting held on 10th of March 2025. Can I call for a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Councillor Lansbury, seconded by Councillor Allison. Thank you. And the next item
We
is.
just need a vote on that.
Oh, sorry. Can I take a vote on it, please? Those all in favour say aye.
Aye.
Anybody against? Okay, declare that carried. Thank you. Next item is ENV 01225, impact of low and mid-rise housing policy stage 2 on the George River LGA. And we're going to hear from Mr. Luke Osti, who's a principal strategic planner. He's going to give us an overview on that. Good, Mr. Osti.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, can we just get a mover and a seconder before we?
Sorry.
Yep, thank you.
Go back here. Can I call for a mover? Councillor Allison, and second by Councillor Lansbury. Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. I'll give a brief summary of the report before the committee. So the low and mid-rise housing policy, specifically stage 2, which is the main crux of it, came into effect in late February this year on the 28th. Council's already received a report on that policy. So it's a fairly high-level summary report. The report before you is a much more detailed report that goes through the implications for Georges River and looks at each precinct quite specifically. In terms of just a few key points about the policy itself, there's some exclusions to where the policy can or cannot apply. In terms of the exclusions of where it cannot apply, if the land is affected, is mapped as bushfire-prone land, is identified as a coastal wetland, littoral rainforest or coastal vulnerability area, it doesn't apply. Any land that contains a heritage item, it does not apply. However, if you're in a heritage conservation area, it still does. Anything affected by flooding in the Georges River catchment, and I'll get to that in more detail a bit later on, but that's a specific catchment. Average noise exposure frequency of 20 or greater, that's the AEDF contours. If you're in that area, that lot does not apply. Land located within 200 metres of a high pressure gas pipeline that follows the East Hills rail line. And finally, the Todd program area in the Cogra North precinct, it doesn't apply there also. Another really key point, anyone wanting to use the LMR policy provisions, a developer or landowner, they have to lodge a DA. CDCs or complying development at this stage is not a permissible pathway to access these planning provisions. That might change in the future, but that is the case at this stage. I'll draw your attention to Appendix 2 of the report, which is an information sheet, which is effectively a summary of the policy itself. It shows all of the precincts that this policy applies within. So that's Beverly Hills, Hurstville, Cogra, Mortdale, Oatley, Penshurst and Riverwood. There is an indicative map on the department's website. I should stress that that's indicative. The way this policy works is if you want to access these provisions, you have to prove that you're within either 400 metres for certain provisions or 800 metres for other provisions of the station or the edge of the centre where this policy applies. That's a walkability measure, and it literally means you need to be able to safely walk to the edge of your lot within that distance. That's why the mapping is indicative. The department couldn't do that mapping accurately enough to show exactly which policies do and don't apply. Every DA has to prove that the policy applies to that particular lot. There's been some key changes to permissibility in the LMR policy. Multi-dwelling housing and terraces being permitted now in the R2 low density zone, and arguably more importantly, residential flat buildings being permitted in the R2 and R3 zones. Obviously only within those LMR policy areas, which is 800 metres walking distance from those stations and precincts. The policy is trying to facilitate low-rise and mid-rise housing. What the department means by that, for low-rise, it means primarily two-storey built form outcomes through dual occupancies, terraces or manor homes potentially. And mid-rise, they classify as development from 3 to 6 stories, being residential flat buildings and shop top housing. In terms of the development standards under this policy, there's some key increases, I suppose, to those development standards that we already have in the LEP. The big one being, or a couple of big ones being, or significant departures, I should say, is that the change in the lot size requirements for dual occupancies. Currently, under our LEP, a 650 square metre lot typically is required. That will be dropped down to 450 square metres, basically meaning you can build dual occupancies on much smaller lots. And the other large change is in the development standards around residential flat buildings. If you're within 400 metres walking distance from one of these centres, the maximum height is 22 metres, or roughly 6 stories, and a 2.2 FSR. And if you're between the 400 and 800 metre walkability catchment, that's 17.5 metres, which is 4 stories. That's quite a bit larger than what's currently permitted in the LEP, typically noting our R4 zone and those development standards change a bit from place to place. So we've gone through and calculated the theoretical capacity that this policy change has created and compared that to both our existing capacity under the LEP as well as the capacity in comparison to some of our strategic planning projects, including the housing planning proposal that we talked about, that was mentioned earlier, I should say. The theoretical capacity increase is significant, unsurprisingly, given some of these more generous development standards and permissibility changes that have been introduced. In the R2 zone, it is a very significant increase of about triple. I should note there is theoretically even more capacity than that. However, as figure 4 and 5 in the report show, that capacity, we don't think as staff is realistic, because although you can technically build a residential flat building under this policy on a 500 square metre block, that just literally can't fit when you comply with all the other controls. So we've lifted that to an 800 metre lot size, which is more realistic. So that's why there's a range of capacity when it comes to the R2 zone. There's also a significant increase in the theoretical capacity in the R3 zone, primarily because you can now build residential flat buildings if you sit within one of these LMR policy areas. That's more than double the current capacity. The R4 zone, the changes are more minor because our controls at times are greater than those through the LMR policy. We've broken down the theoretical capacity as well for each precinct. Beverly Hills, Hurstville, Cogra, Mortdale, Oatley, Penshurst and Riverwood, as I mentioned earlier, and that's contained within table 2 of the report. We've also then used a logic that adopts a calculation from some recent housing data analysis done by ID Consulting that looked at the last 5 years of census data and how much of the theoretical planning capacity in our areas is actually taken up by development and DAs lodged. So that number changes from precinct to precinct, but that gives us the best educated guess that we can have at this stage in terms of what potential development outcomes might come from the LMR policy. In terms of the specific strategic planning projects that are on the books at the moment, the housing planning proposal is probably the main one. It's also known as the integrated planning proposal. You all know that there's 2 halves to that. There's the housing component and then there's the biodiversity component. Effectively, this was Council's alternative solution to the problem put to us by the department, and we sought an exemption from the LMR policy through this alternate proposal. We've recently received advice from the department that has been rejected and the LMR policy applies here in this council. I should stress that's been the case for basically every other council in Sydney, with the exception of Wallandilly, I believe, because they have a unique context, and Bathurst Council. Obviously pretty different to most Sydney councils. In terms of the capacity unlocked at a high level, there's quite a bit of detail in the report in table 3, but I guess the headline numbers are the housing planning proposal is going to unlock roughly up to 8,000 dwellings theoretically. The low and mid-rise housing policy unlocks 11,000 and in much more concentrated areas around those station precincts. As I said, the department has knocked back our alternate proposal. So we've put a recommendation to council through this report that we no longer progress with that housing planning proposal because the low and mid-rise housing has come in and taken effect. It doesn't make sense for us to double effectively or even more than double what we're originally proposing. It's sort of an either or decision to make, and from our perspective, given the LMR policy has been thrust upon us, we don't have a choice at this stage. We should do our best with that, and sadly, I suppose, given the work that was put into it, abandon the housing planning proposal. However, the second half of that integrated planning proposal, the biodiversity component, we believe there's still merit to that proposal, so we'll continue pushing forward with that. The department has given us a bunch of questions, I suppose, or required additional justification for that half of the planning proposal, and staff will be working on that to continue it progressing through the plan making process. I'll skip through the rest relatively quickly, but basically we go through all of the precincts affected. We start with Mortdale, and there's a suggestion there, given the recent Mortdale master plan and the work that's ongoing there, in terms of how we adapt to this LMR policy change in the context of that master plan that's been endorsed. Beverly Hills, we recommend that we go back to the department and push back on their flooding decision. As I mentioned earlier, flood affected lots are not capable of using the low and mid-rise housing policy in the Georges River catchment. However, in Beverly Hills, it's the Cooks River catchment. We think that's an oversight. So there's an issue there where, regardless of what catchment you're in, flooding is flooding, and that's a safety issue for new development. So I think council will probably remember that a couple of months ago we put forward the Beverly Hills master plan with some changes to respond to the flood risk there. That should be replicated by the department. Cogra and Riverwood are 2 centres that council have just begun doing master planning work on, and there'll be briefings held with council in the future as that work progresses. In terms of Cogra, the changes that the LMR policy bring forward don't make a big difference because the development controls are already fairly generous. However, in Riverwood, it does increase theoretical capacity, and this can be considered and responded to through the master planning process. Hurstville has also been nominated in the LMR policy. Again, the impact is not huge because the development controls are fairly generous already around Hurstville. However, we've spoken about in the report some of the capacity unlocked in that space. Penshurst, again, table 12 in the report goes through the theoretical capacity unlocked by the LMR. There's potentially some significant capacity opportunities there if the development industry wants to take up those new planning controls, especially in the R3 zone to the east of the station. And finally, Oatley probably has the biggest increase to theoretical capacity out of all of the precincts, primarily because of the large lots and undeveloped nature of the west side of Oatley, but even the east side as well, where you have some R3 and R4 zoned land that doesn't have much, walk-up flat buildings on them already, basically. Again, all of that capacity analysis is in the report. In terms of some other high-level implications, infrastructure is a key concern of Council. This policy hasn't introduced any mechanisms to increase infrastructure provision, whether that's open space, traffic and transport upgrades, community facilities, anything like that. That's a key concern for Council. We will be monitoring how the development industry responds to this policy change and whether we have an influx of development being lodged and potentially approved. That's something we'll keep an eye on and continue monitoring. So the recommendations are there in the book. We're recommending, as I said, that we do not progress with the housing planning proposal anymore. There's some specific recommendations around Beverly Hills and Mortdale, given the master planning processes going on there, and the rest of the precincts. Essentially, the recommendation is to keep monitoring and responding as we see what the development industry does. We don't know how feasible these controls are to our specific LGA. We have some reservations about how much take-up will occur, but we don't know at this point. So we'll monitor and see what happens. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Mr. Trusty. Are there any questions or comments from councillors? Councillor Lansbury.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Not actually questions, just to have a couple of comments, if I may. Firstly, thank you for such a comprehensive report. A lot of work has gone into preparing this, a lot of information for us to digest about the implications of this policy. I'm going to say it again. I'm supporting the recommendation because I think it's the best of the situation that we've been dealt, kind of like saving the furniture a bit to salvage the part about the biodiversity aspect of it, as in part A. It's most unfortunate, in my view, that the state government didn't accept a planning proposal as prepared by our council officers, because the amount of work that went into it to identify the best locations for uplift, I think, was really sound. Unfortunately, there seems to have been a bit of a blanket. I didn't realise there was a couple of exceptions to a couple of LGAs, but a bit of a blanket refusal to councils trying to identify, having done the work for very many years, as to where uplift might be best suited. I think the way that we've landed in this is we have to accept that this is the policy that we've got. Whether there will be the uptake, that's debatable as well. Without giving any clues to anybody locally, I did see a piece on the ABC recently about in other areas in the eastern suburbs, for example, they're going off. Some of their real estate agents are saying that they've not been this busy in more than 20 years, and architects as well. And another location on the north side, a man who had a heritage listed property that was isolated because his neighbours either side of him didn't have contributing examples of heritage, so they're sort of consolidated their lots, and their neighbours are constructing apartment buildings, and so he's isolated. The developers don't want his because it has heritage listing, so they can't do anything with it. I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of some of the features of this particular policy. I understand where it's coming from. I've advocated for a very long time we have to do something about the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. It remains to be seen where we'll go with it locally. Let's hope that we don't end up with heritage properties in Penshurst Conservation Area with 6-storey apartment buildings next door to them. That's my real fear, but I wish that we've been able to manage that part of the process a little bit more. Perhaps they won't be able to consolidate blocks, as you've said, to provide the capacity to build something like that. I think that we are moving forward with this particular recommendation, as Mr. Polk has said, or at least we can protect our foreshores, hopefully, if they accept that. They didn't accept the housing. Let's hope that they'll accept that aspect of it as in Part A. We need to try and manage it in some way. Otherwise, it's just a bit of a dirt sandwich, really, that we've been dealt by not having any control. And again, I've been around long enough to see how many different iterations of housing policies by successive governments that have come in with these great plans. There's never been any additional open space provided because it's just not possible. No additional infrastructure. I recall with the metro strategy back in the early 2000s, they had a bit of a roadshow that went around to councils to talk it up, and everybody asked the same questions. What about additional infrastructure? And was, well, that wasn't their part to contribute. They were providing the planning capacity or directing councils to provide the planning capacity. Yeah, I'm a bit fearful. I don't want to sort of scare the horses too much, but it's a bit unnerving that we've lost control after the amount of work that went into identifying over 8,000 locations, which now could be, if all the uptake was given, to over 11,000. I'm skeptical about those sorts of numbers because we haven't seen, I don't think, anything come in from Mortdale after we resolved to carry that master plan, but everybody could have been sitting back waiting for where we landed with this. But again, like, thank you for all of the work that has been put into this. I think we've got a really comprehensive understanding of what the implications may be. I don't want to be too doom and gloom about it, but I do have my reservations. However, I think that this resolution that we've got before us tonight is the best way forward, given the situation we find ourselves in.
Thanks, Councillor Lasry. Councillor Johnson.
I'd like to also speak to it as well. And at first glance, policies that promise more housing, greater density and faster approval seems like a step in the right direction. We all acknowledge that New South Wales and Sydney in particular face a housing challenge. But what we don't need is a planning free-for-all that forgets one crucial ingredient, the community. Mortdale and Penshurst are not blank canvases. They are not just postcodes on a planning map. These are thriving, living, breathing communities. We have heritage streetscapes, walkable villages, family-owned business, parks where kids learn to ride bikes and neighbours who greet each other by name. And here's the part that must not be overlooked. Georges River Council has already done the work. We put a well-researched, thoughtful solution that delivered the required housing capacity while respecting the character of our suburbs and protecting our heritage and environmentally sensitive areas. This wasn't a wish list, it was a plan rooted in evidence, shaped by community consultation and guided by sustainable planning principles. But under the current set, we're not talking about a few changes around the edges, we're talking about the biggest planning transformation this area has ever seen. The most significant proposal to rezone the majority of the all R2 low density residential land to allow 3-story walk-up flats. That means streets of family homes gone, McRae's estate gone, O'Brien's estate gone. The quiet backyards, the front porches, the space where kids play, replaced with walk-ups. This is not gentle infill, this is not subtle growth. This is a move that would decimate the very character of our suburbs. We are not anti-housing, but this approach is blunt and disrespectful. It treats communities as if they're problems to be solved rather than places to be nurtured. We're already seeing the cracks, quite literally. We have ongoing sewage spillages in parts of our suburbs. The system is already under pressure, and yet we're being asked to add thousands more people to it. Where is the infrastructure investment to support even our current needs, let alone future ones? We just can't keep adding people without serious investment in the foundations that make livability possible. Roads, transport, schools, hospitals, water, sewerage, green space. When is that coming? And why are we not seeing it before more density is forced upon us? We ask, where are the traffic studies? Where are the additional school places? Where is the funding for upgrades to our aging pipes and services? And why are local councils and communities being sidelined? In Mortdale, we just fought hard for a scaled-back master plan, one that better reflected our values and visions for the area. This step could undo that work overnight. In Penshurst, where the charm of the local centre draws both residents and visitors alike, high-rise towers are not what the community envisioned when we said we support growth. We support smart growth, sustainable, respectful, human-scale development. Let me be clear, this is not a case of NIMBY, not in my backyard. This is a case of, yes, in my backyard, but done right. We understand the need to build more homes, but they must be the right homes in the right places with the right support structures around them. Minister Scully, we urge you, let us work with you, not around you. Honour local planning frameworks, empower councils to guide growth intelligently, and most of all, respect the people who already live in these suburbs, who've raised families here, who volunteer here, who built these communities from the ground up. Because if this step is truly about housing for people, not just numbers, then the people of Mortdale and Penshurst must be part of the solution.
Thanks, Councillor Jamieson. Any other councillors with any questions or comments? Councillor Ellison, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to echo also what Christina and Councillor Lansley said. Our planning experts at Council have applied local knowledge to produce a homegrown housing policy that satisfied the early state government housing target without compromising protection of our much loved FSPA and heritage areas. A moment later, and the state government has ignored our housing planning proposal and foisted a generic housing plan on our community in the guise of the LMR policy. This is a very much unwelcomed alternative. The LMR won't necessarily house renters or first-time home buyers or even downsizers, and certainly won't be fostering quality design. It's becoming more obvious that this square peg in a round hole approach is a social experiment tinged with environmental devastation. The planning controls allowing larger housing on smaller lots and increased floor space ratio that isn't even achievable within their height controls will certainly bring about design of an inferior quality. We in the Georges River Council local area are currently sitting on a 20% tree canopy cover, down from 22% 5 short years ago. So we are already heading in the wrong direction on that count, and we'll be creating bigger houses on smaller blocks with more driveway crossings from dual occupancies, dissecting our nature strips and denuding our streetscapes. As this LMR plays out, it's looking highly unlikely that we'll be able to attain the state government's stipulated 40% tree canopy cover by 2038. Our leafy neighbourhoods are in better hands when our council can influence higher quality design, and more streamlined transitions in R2, R3 and R4 development. With a sensitivity to neighbours who will now find themselves under siege from a state government planning policy, appeasing developers unconnected to country, leaving residents to navigate their way through a harsher landscape of busier roads and hotter summers. Being the local entity, council are cognizant of the needs of the residents, while the state government is seen here to be dictating the terms of a juggernaut caught in the doldrums of a housing availability. This shortfall was already factored into council sensitive plans, despite the state government's blind insistence on a one-size-fits-all policy. A very contentious knee-jerk reaction that will place more unnecessary pressure on our already stressed neighbours. But after all this, what really deeply concerns me tonight are the key conditions imposed on Council's biodiversity planning proposal in the Gateway determination. Chief among them is the requirement for Council to justify the 1,000 square metre minimum lot size for dual occupancies within the FSPA and the unique character areas. Equally alarming is the condition that removes support for unique character area within the LEP, relegating their identification to the Development Control Plan, a move that strips them of statutory protection that significantly weakens planning controls. We've all witnessed the environmental degradation and overdevelopment along our foreshore, sprawling McMansions often approved via the complying development certificate, with scant regard for local character or biodiversity. In response, Council sought to exclude the FSPA and proposed unique character areas from the low-rise housing diversity code, which would have prevented dual occupancies being approved as CDCs in these environmentally sensitive areas. Disappointingly, this request has been rejected by the State Planning Department. I want to say that I particularly support recommendation E of tonight's report to progress the biodiversity planning proposal on its own. I call on the state government to urgently reconsider their gateway conditions, which remove critical protections for our foreshore, unique character areas, and our overarching biodiversity. We can't take this lying down, and I strongly encourage the community, especially the residents in Peakhurst Ward, to raise your voices. Make your concerns heard loud and clear by the state government. We want protection for our unique natural environment and the leafy character of our neighbourhoods before it all ends up in the back of the truck. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ellison. Councillor Neville.
Thank you, Chair. I too would like to echo my disappointment that the New South Wales Planning Department has not supported Council's housing planning proposal as a replacement for the LMR policy. Our housing planning proposal would have delivered immediate capacity for over 8,000 homes in Georges River by making adjustment to our planning controls. These were careful, considered changes developed by our expert planners that delivered capacity for new housing, spread the load of new dwellings across the LGA, and most importantly, protected the character of our local suburbs, our heritage conservation areas, and our sensitive biodiverse areas. We wanted to play our role and be part of the solution. Instead, we've been handed a one size fits all LMR policy that focuses solely on homes being well located, essentially meaning close to the train stations. That's fine in theory, but in practice, it's led to non-discretionary controls and oversimplified standards, including the reduction of parking requirements to just one space per dwelling, regardless of the number of bedrooms. We're already receiving complaints from residents near train stations about serious parking issues, so these problems are only going to intensify under the LMR policy's reduced parking provisions. But what about well-designed homes, the other side of the equation? Expert advice informs us that the LMR reforms simply won't deliver well-designed homes. The standards are non-discretionary, which means councils can't reject development applications based on height, bulk, or scale, as long as they meet the state set rules, even if they clearly don't fit the character of the area. The reforms offer generous floor space ratios, but limit building heights, which means to fit in the extra floor areas, developers will likely have to compromise on things like setbacks, building separation, and landscaping, key elements that contribute to good design. The Apartment Design Guide sets out clear requirements like minimum distance between buildings, but in practice, infill development rarely meets these. The result? Short, bulky buildings squeezed onto sites that weren't meant for this scale, a far cry from well designed. Despite early promises for refinement, none of these issues have been addressed. Instead, we're left with a planning framework that puts pressure on good design outcomes and will almost certainly lead to poor quality housing and diminished amenity for our communities. The LMR reforms only deliver capacity for around 3,000 more dwellings than Georges River's own housing planning proposal, yet the cost to our neighbourhood's character will be irreversible. The LMR applies a blanket approach across New South Wales, but we know that not all the capacity will be taken up by the market. Development will cluster where it's most profitable, often creating isolated pockets of high-density housing that clash with existing communities. Instead of this scattergun approach, why not let Georges River implement its own housing planning proposal? Ours delivers well-located and well-designed homes with the ability to manage impacts locally. Let us assess the take-up and deliver growth in a way that respects and protects the character of our area. And let's not forget, these reforms come with no funding or forward planning for essential infrastructure, green space, stormwater, public spaces and amenities. None of it has been considered. We owe it to our community to advocate for a better, more balanced approach, one that plans for people and not just postcodes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, in that case, I've got a comment of my own I'll read out. I thank the staff for compiling such a comprehensive report, and I share the concerns expressed by my councillor colleagues tonight. Speaking both as a resident and as councillor over the past 5 years or so, the community of Peakhurst Ward has raised concerns about the impact of possible development within the Foreshore Scenic Protection Area, or FSPA, with council's professional planners. In particular, Ms. McMahon, Manager Strategic Planning, and Ms. Bishop, our former Director, listened closely and crafted proposals perfectly aligned with the community's strong desire to safeguard the environment and local character. We were witness to similar expertise when they presented alternatives for the Mortar Master Plan. It is disappointing that the government has not only seen fit to override community sentiment, but it has appeared to disregard the expertise of council planners who possess such vast knowledge. Despite the exhaustive work completed by council staff in conducting various studies and consultations in a strong bid to both achieve our targets and get it right for our residents, the government seems to have little grasp of local community opinion and environmental protection. I'll now put this report to a vote.
Madam Mayor, your vote, please.
For.
Mr. Chair.
For.
Councillor Allison.
For.
Councillor Arthur.
For.
Councillor Jamieson.
For.
Councillor Lansbury.
For.
6 votes for.
Thank you. Declare that carried. Okay. The next item, we'll have to move into confidential session. At this stage of the meeting, which is 7:41 p.m, I hereby advise that the meeting will move into a committee of the whole to allow consideration of a matter in closed session in accordance with Section 10A of the Local Government Act 1993. Accordingly, members of the press and public are excluded from the closed session, and access to the correspondence and reports relating to the items considered during the course of this closed session will be withheld. This action is being taken to allow discussion of the following item. Which is ENV 014A-25 expansion of development and building resourcing, item 7 of the action plan to the Department of Housing and Infrastructure, or DPHI. Are there any objections from the public gallery to the meeting moving into closed session? Mr. Hill, were there any representations from the public?
Mr. Chair, no, they were not.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll now move to a procedural motion that, in accordance with Section 10A, Clause 2 of Local Government Act 1993, the council enters into closed session to discuss the matters previously read aloud to the meeting.
Move that, Mr. Chair.
I think I get a second that, please. Mayor Borg and Councillor Allison. Thank you. Thank you. And could you have the doors to the meeting room open as well? Okay, we now have the confirmation of recommendations from the closed session or committee of the whole. And the recommendations are now up on the screen. Can I call for a motion to confirm?
I'll move that.
Thank you. Moved by Mayor Ball, seconded by Councillor Jamieson, I think. And the motion is that the recommendations for the items considering closed session be confirmed as recommendations of this committee. Could I get a mover for that and seconder? Oh, sorry. Thanks. All right. Yeah. So just a normal vote. Okay. All those in favour of that motion, say aye. Anybody against? Declare that carried. There being no other business on the agenda, I declare the meeting closed at 8 p.m. Thanks, everyone.